You have to understand the SNPs. This is really worth looking at. When we didn't have a big parliamentary group, and there was only 4 of us at Westminster, the party organisation was all important. I mean, I had to stand, for deputy leader, I had to stand for the national executive. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, I had to go to our national executive and get an agreement on what I was to say in Parliament. Now, I was all in favour of us pushing them out, but the executive, actually, when we started the conversation, weren't at all in favour of us engaging in war. And there was a whole morning where I sort of said to him, I'm the foreign affairs spokesman, I'm going to make a speech next week. And actually, the best I could get out of it, because the power lay with the national executive, was that we'd abstain. And when the debate came and I made this speech, and if I may say so, it was a very good speech because I knew what I was talking about, George Galloway torpedoed me in the last 3 seconds. George said, "How are you going to vote?" And after this speech, which was all about getting rid of Saddam, I had to say, abstain, to great laughter. What about a deflation, I can tell you. But the power lay in the party. As before 1945 in the Labour Party, power lay in the party. When Churchill wanted to continue the coalition until the defeat of Japan, there was a Labour Party conference on. And Attlee had to ask the national executive what the decision was, which they said no. Once 45 came and you had a huge parliamentary group which had to deal with the government and every day, power shifted from the party to the parliamentary party in Westminster. But the Labour Party at that time had enough sense to maintain the importance of the party, the conference and the national executive. That's what Tony Blair actually destroyed when he became the leader. He just made sure that, so the power lay on that side. The SNP in 1999 got a big parliamentary group. And suddenly power switched from the party to the parliamentary group. And the SNP leadership didn't have the wisdom to realise that you've actually got to maintain something significant for the party organisation and its supreme body, the national executive. If you look at the SNP constitution tonight, the important body is the national executive. But you go onto the SNP website and you try and find it. You don't know, and I don't know, who chairs the national executive because he's appointed by the leader. So what happens then in the SNP? You have the parliamentary party, big group for the first time. And what happens within that is the leadership takes control of policy. When the white paper was published, Margot was ill, I went down to get her copy. And I'm standing beside an SNP member of the Scottish Parliament. And I said to him, "You ken the difference between you and me?" And it's no, because you're an MSP, by the way. The difference between you and me, we're both members of the party, but see, when I pick that up, I don't need to agree with it. You have to agree with every word. You have no alternative. You never made any contribution towards it. The backbenchers were never asked their opinion. There were no cabinet committees producing the white paper. It's a very, very tiny group that produced the white paper, which meant it had salient weaknesses because there wasn't a big wide circle of discussion that went on. And the question for a party now with 90,000 members, can that imbalance between the parliamentary group, which means a very small group of leaders, and the party, can that be allowed to continue? So how do we get debate going? I think it's up to the members of the party, the rank and file of the party, to say we want a say in policy and we want a post-mortem. What went wrong? Because although we boast about being one of the 45, the fact of the matter is we lost. And there are reasons why we lost. Currency was one. The Fiscal Commission was more important than any member of the party. And yet we had people in the party who knew fine that a joint currency passed the initiative to George Osborne. All you need to say was no, and we had uncertainty from the very beginning. There was no examination of what we would do when it was evident the European Union would say no. That cannot be allowed to happen again. I know the SNP alone cannot deliver independence, but as it's proved during the referendum, in the public eye, it is the most important part of the Yes campaign. So really it's a challenge to the members. Are they prepared to say to the new leadership, we can't continue as we did, we want a better balance for the party? I mean, for example, I believe you can start balancing better if the Cabinet met the National Executive every 4 or 5 weeks for joint discussion. That would raise in the press eyes and in the public eyes the status of the National Executive. And it might prompt people in the National Executive to say, well, we've got 1 or 2 questions where we don't agree with you, we better have working parties established between the government and the party to look into issues such as I've talked about tonight. And if we get into the post-mortem, we shouldn't enter the blame game. And I don't want to do that. But at the same time, we have to have the honesty to say, where did we make a mistake? At almost every meeting I was at, I had to explain why ALEC was technically correct, that it was in their interest to have a currency union. But if they said no, nothing you could do about it. We had to have the alternative, and then I had to spend time in explaining. But that was very difficult to take people along because the currency union was the big thing. When Scottish Widows come out with their statement, this is going to cause us real problems and all the rest of it, I wrote to the Chief Executive of Scottish Widows and said, unlike others who are attacking you, I'm not, because I understand. Currency matters to you because almost 90% of your clients are external to the Scottish border. But what if we have a Scottish pound, which is 1-to-1 with sterling? I mean, you use that at the moment. All of us, if you go into your purse, your wallet just now, you have Scots pounds, 1-to-1 with sterling. Would that create a problem for you? I mean, he wrote back and said, I don't enter these sort of hypothetical. But I was just me. If in fact the First Minister had written to him, he couldn't brush him aside the way he could brush me aside. And that's where mistakes were in fact made that cannot be repeated. That's the message, that everybody did everything they did for the correct reasons, and if mistakes were made, they weren't made maliciously. Yeah. And so it's not blaming anybody. I made mistakes, everybody made mistakes, but we have to have a sensible examination of where we went wrong on the yes side and make sure that we sort that out. And one of the areas, as I've said tonight, is the European Union.
Just on that point, John, it's quite interesting actually you mentioned EFTA, because when I was at the SNP conference in 2012 and 2013, the EFTA were actually there. There was actually, in the fringe setups, the EFTA were actually there. Ian Hutchinson and Alan Smith were actually having debates, quite open debates with party members, with other members of EFTA. So
on the fringe. But it has to be in the central, it has to be inside the conference, it has to be inside the party, and policies have got to be taken. I mean, why wasn't the leadership asked, why aren't you talking to EFTA formally? So that we're armed when we go in and the EU says, you're not getting in, say, well, we couldn't care less. We're off somewhere else, we've got it all fixed. So I think, it really is, it's a challenge for the membership. And if somebody says to me, you're attacking the leadership of the SNP, that I'm not. Mistakes by the leadership are the fault of the party members. For far too long, the conference was a clap-in, where there was no real criticism of anything that was being done by the leadership. They were delighted that we were a big group in, they were delighted when we were a minority government, even more delighted when we were a majority government, and therefore, in my view, stopped thinking. And it's high time we all began thinking again.